Hi. Well, today we've got a little quiz on intervals, something that every musician really needs to know about at some point. So on the board, I've got a number of intervals for you to name that involve use of the treble clef, the bass clef, the alto clef, and the tenor clef. So you may want to pause at this moment and just see how you get on, or feel free to stick with me if you want to while I just go through and explain the answers to each of these intervals. So, just a quick recap on how we calculate intervals, or what I perceive to be the best means of doing so anyway, which is this. First of all, work out the number of the interval. So we look at the first one. This is a G to a C. What the number is by counting the G as number 1, G, A, B, C confirms that this is a fourth. So the first thing to do is get the number of the interval in place. The second thing to do then is to work in the major scale of the lower note. So if the lower note's G, well, what's the fourth note of G major? The fourth note of G major is C. So in other words, C is in the major scale of the lower note, the G. And remember, if the upper note's in the major scale of the lower note, if it's a fourth, a fifth, or an octave, it's a perfect interval. And if it's anything else, it's a major interval. And only when the upper note isn't in the major scale of the lower note do you then have to kind of tweak things from there, and we'll come to that in due course. But the first one is a perfect fourth. G to C, 1, 2, 3, 4. The C's in the major scale of G. So it's a perfect fourth, and that's the sound of the interval, G to C, or if I play them together, there's the sound of a fourth. And while you're learning to recognize intervals, it's a very good thing to get them orally centered as well, so you get some idea what these particular intervals sound like. Okay, interval B. So we're in the bass clef. We're working with A flat at the bottom up to F at the top. So don't worry about the A flat for a moment. Some kind of A to some kind of F. What's the number? A, B, C, D, E, F. So it must be a 6. So always commit to the number first so you don't get persuaded somewhere down the line that it might be some kind of 5th or 7th or something. That's definitely a 6 because it's some kind of A to some kind of F. Okay, A flat major. What is the sixth note of the scale of A flat major? Which is why it's also good revision of keys and knowing what key signatures are for particular keys. A flat major, the sixth note is F. So F is in the major scale of the lower note. So if the interval is a 6, then it must be a major 6. Remember, fourth, fifth, octave are perfect, but the second, the third, the sixth and the seventh, the other ones have to be major. So if that note is the sixth note of A flat major, it's a major 6, which it is. Great, what does it sound like? A flat up to F. So there is a major 6, or if I play them together, that's what it sounds like. So clocking the sound of that as well. Interval C is interestingly in the alto clef, so it's a chance just to revise your alto clef as well. Remember, in the alto clef, the line in the middle of the stave is middle C. You see where that bar is on the clef, so that's middle C. So if that's middle C, this note must be B, and then you can work out where you're going from there. C, D, E, F. So it's B up to F. So first of all, let's have the number of the interval. B, C, D, E, F, it's a fifth. So before you decide what kind of fifth it is, you can commit to the fact that it's definitely a fifth and nothing else. Now, B's at the bottom. Let's think in B major. We know we're dealing with a fifth. So what's the fifth note of B major? Well, B major has got 5 sharps, and the first of those is F sharp. So in other words, if this interval happened to be B to F sharp, it would be a perfect fifth because F sharp is the fifth note of B major. So now we're looking at this thinking, well, that's fine, but this isn't F sharp, it's F natural. So the question is this interval bigger or smaller than a perfect fifth? So if a perfect fifth is B to F sharp, we're now looking at B to F. Can you see what I've done there? B to F sharp, B to F. So my hands are closer together by one semitone. In other words, the interval, the distance between the two notes, is a semitone smaller than a perfect interval should be. If you're a semitone smaller than a perfect fifth, you're going to have a diminished fifth. So this is a diminished fifth. So a semitone smaller than perfect is diminished. A semitone bigger than perfect is augmented. So that's a diminished fifth. It's got a very distinctive sound actually. B up to F. Play that together. You can hear it's a very distinctive sound, isn't it? Sometimes called a tritone because it comprises three tones. 1, 2, 3. So there it is. Diminished fifth. Okay, interval D is in the tenor clef. So the tenor clef works like the alto clef, it's just that it's a bit higher. So this time C isn't in the middle, it's on line 4, and it's always middle C, just for reference. So there's middle C in the tenor clef. So what are we looking at here? D, because it's just one above that, D, E, F. So it's D up to F. So what's the number of the interval? D, E, F, it's a third. Then I'm going to think, if the bottom note's D, I'm going to work in D major. What's the third note of D major? The answer is F sharp. So let's do this little game again. D, F sharp is a major third, but D, F natural, my hands are a step closer together, aren't they? So in other words, the interval is slightly smaller, one semitone smaller than a major third. Okay, now if you have a major interval and you make it a semitone smaller, it becomes minor. Make it another semitone smaller, it becomes diminished. If you have a major interval and you make it a semitone bigger, it becomes augmented. So D to F sharp should be a major third. This is D to F natural. It's a semitone smaller than a major interval, so it's a minor interval, minor third. This is what it sounds like. Here's D, here's F. Put them both together, minor third. Okay, for interval E, we're back into the bass clef. Now, quite a wide interval this time. So what have we got? We've got G at the bottom and we've got B at the top. Two ways of describing this. First of all, you can count up. You can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you can say that's a tenth. Or you can say any interval that's more than an octave is something we call a compound interval. So the first thing to write down if you're naming it on paper is the word compound. Then you can either take the top note down an octave, or you can bring the bottom note up an octave and say what's the interval. So if we do that, we can either talk about a tenth, or we could say, well, let's bring this B down an octave to B, and then I'm going to go G, A, B. So it's a third. It's not a third, it's a compound third. And to be precise, it's a compound something third, which we're now going to work out. So if it's G to B, a compound something third, in G major, the lower note, what should the third note be? And the answer is B. So B is the third note of G major. Therefore, it's a major third. So this is a compound major third. Here's G, here's B. Put them both together. There you've got your compound major third. Because it's a major third, a compound major third, you could also call it a major tenth, and that would be perfectly in order. Interval F, we've got A at the bottom in the treble clef going up to G at the top. So what's the number of the interval, the distance? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Remember, always count the lower note as number 1. So that's a seventh. Well, what kind of seventh is it? A major, the seventh note of A major is G sharp. So if it were A to G sharp, that would be a major seventh. So A to G sharp, major seventh. What's happened here? G sharp is not G sharp, it's G natural. So my interval is a semitone smaller than a major seventh. So semitone smaller than major is minor. So therefore, A up to G is a minor seventh. This is what it sounds like. A up to G. Put them two together. There's your minor seventh. And finally, let's have a look at interval G. We're back in the treble clef. We've got E at the bottom, A sharp at the top. Calculate the number first. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's a fourth. Work in the major scale of the lower note, E major. What's the fourth note of E major? A natural. So E to A natural would be a perfect fourth, remember, because fourths, fifths and octaves are perfect, all the rest are major. So E to A is a perfect fourth. But this isn't E to A, it's E to A sharp. So what's happened this time? My hands have got a semitone further apart. So what's one semitone bigger than a perfect interval? An augmented interval. So that is an augmented fourth. Here's E, here's A sharp. Play them together, and it's another one of those tritones. 1, 2, 3. You remember we met one back here, and it's interesting, isn't it, that a diminished fifth is the same sound as an augmented fourth, even though one's a fifth and one's a fourth. So there it is, your augmented fourth. So, if you didn't know about intervals, I hope that's kind of got you into it slightly quickly. We've got courses out there in our theory series that will go into this in much more detail and explain it fully for you. If you're wanting to revise the interval knowledge, well, I hope that's been a useful exercise in doing that. And if you needed to have a really secure method for learning how to identify intervals, I hope I've also demonstrated that. And whatever you do, if you can do them theoretically, also learn to recognize intervals orally, because that is of great assistance to any musician.